Back now for some analysis with some of my favorite people. Peggy Noonan, who is a columnist for the Wall Street Journal and a CBS News contributor. David Ignatius is a Washington Post columnist. And in New York this morning, New York Magazine columnist Frank Rich. So Peggy, let me just start with you. This was a tough week for Jeb Bush.
Yeah, it definitely was. He seemed consistently taken aback by the asking of a question anyone could have told you a year and 2 years ago was going to be a primary question of the primary time. It was difficult for him in ways that are almost mysterious. And because I think he showed such discomfort in his answers, he sort of opened up the possibility that this will only be the beginning of many questions about things your brother did. Would you have done them? Do you know what I mean? So it was difficult. However, he deserves, I think, great credit in this. He's going to the press every day. He's taking questions. He's being out there. He's doing sit-down interviews. Mrs. Clinton instead is doing sort of a silent movie of a campaign in which she doesn't feel she has to do those things. I don't think that's a good way to go, and will be problematic for her down the road.
Well, what do you think, David? I would guess that at some point here, Hillary Clinton is going to have a news conference.
She is, I wrote this week, playing a rope-a-dope campaign to remember Muhammad Ali, the fighter, presumably hoping to let Republicans punch themselves out, swinging, and by the time we get to the real campaign, their arms will be tired. I'm not sure that's going to work. I found it genuinely troubling that on an issue where she was involved in the takeoff of the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal, she has been so silent, as if she's really running scared from the liberal wing of her own party and not putting her views out there. I thought the president, but by contrast, was really a strong voice for what he believes in. And I think for Clinton to be compelling, she's going to have that same full-throated expression of what she thinks.
What do you think, Frank Rich? A lot of focus on foreign policy so far in this campaign. Do you think that is going to go right on into when we get into the final years of the campaign season? They seem to last for a couple of years now.
The final decade, it feels like already. I feel, look, if we're at war, which we're unlikely to be, and I hope we won't be, of course it would be an enormous issue. But short of that, I'm not sure. I also feel if Republicans want to distinguish themselves from Hillary Clinton, it's probably not a good way to do it. She is the most hawkish national Democrat can be. She was Secretary of State, which is a credential they don't have. Even if you think she wasn't a great Secretary of State, it's hard to take that away from her. She is the red phone at 3 o'clock in the morning candidate. And you have a bunch of fresh-faced, youngish Republicans, for the most part, who look like neophytes. And no matter how hawkish they all sort of sound the same. They're going to have to put themselves far to the right in sort of neocon territory to distinguish themselves from her. The one exception, Rand Paul, is already sort of cratered on his revolt in Republican foreign policy. So I don't see even the percentage for Republicans, and I think the public as a whole much more interested in domestic issues, particularly as always the economy.
Well, Peggy, let's go back and talk a little bit about this Republican field. There are several dozen of them, but as you heard Bob Gates say earlier today, and he is basically a Republican, although he has worked for 8 presidents. He said he's not impressed with any of them so far.
Yeah, he has a way the past few years of exhibiting a fabulous and dangerous candor, Mr. Gates, and it's a kind of a delight to see. I think there's one little distinction to be made here. He looks at the Republican field and for president and in terms of foreign policy, he says, well, I see pretty thin experience or knowledge, more or less. There's a distinction between the Republican governors going forward for the presidency and the Republican senators. The Republican senators are more immersed and have been more immersed. Their brain space has been filled more with foreign policy. The governors are mostly young men who are in effect catching up. Their brain space the past 8 years has been full of domestic issues and sewer contracts and how the state is doing in terms of its economic environment. I do think, however, that the 2016 election will be both an economic and a foreign policy election. It's a great cliche of American politics that every presidential is about the economy. This one, I think, will be half economy and half foreign policy, because we all sense that the world is exploding every day. So it will be important, and there are Republicans who I think have some distance to go to make up for some gaps.
Well, David, my sense of it is that no job, being a senator, being a governor, being a business executive, prepares one for being president of the United States.
I think that's absolutely right. We referred earlier in the broadcast to Harry Truman, in one sense utterly unprepared to become president after Franklin Roosevelt, and yet he, by most accounts, was a superb foreign policy leader. This Republican field, with some exceptions, I think Marco Rubio speaks powerfully with some real ideas about foreign policy. Generally, they don't have a lot of experience. We've learned watching Barack Obama learn on the job the dangers of that, and I think the American public, looking at this election, that's one thing Hillary Clinton really has going for her. I wonder if people will want to roll the dice again with a very inexperienced person. I mean, Frank Rich is right, we're not at war, but we are fighting a very dangerous terrorist adversary in ISIS, which is expanding. Congressman Noonan is right. It is becoming a global force. So that'll be a factor in 2016, and people want somebody who they have confidence is going to be a good leader in that.
You know, Frank, and you just did a piece about this in New York Magazine about the situation in Baltimore, which is not about foreign policy in the least, but it certainly seems to me to be an issue before the American people right now. And this is this sort of racial divide that we have been reminded of, for want of a better way to say it, by these recent events involving the police and African Americans.
Well, exactly. And keep in mind where the conventions are taking place in 2016. And the Republicans are in Cleveland, the Democrats are in Philadelphia. Both these cities have had police departments with African-American police chiefs investigated by the Justice Department for abuses, much in the way the Baltimore Department is now. Both these cities have an enormous amount of poverty and unemployment, which is much a piece of this as race. We're going to see two conventions, I think, in a very tone-deaf way, I suspect, in both cases, partying there. And it's sort of going to dramatize, I think, a big domestic problem we have. You know, Cleveland is where the 12-year-old Tamir Rice, you know, was killed for carrying a toy gun. There have been similar cases in Philadelphia. All of this is going to be front and center in 2016. It's not going away. It's never gone away, even before recent years. And I feel, you know, it's going to be much more, short of war, I think it's going to be a much bigger deal than the Middle East.
Do you think this is something that goes beyond police relations with the black communities? Because I certainly do.
Oh, yeah.
I think what we are reminded of here and what we've been seeing is that African Americans can look at one set of facts and white people can look at the same set of facts and sometimes come up with entirely different conclusions. And it seems to me that's what we need to be working on and thinking about right now. And how do you bridge that gap, Frank? What?
It's very, very difficult. No one has a real solution, and we get into the stale debate about government versus private enterprise. But and we talk about having a national discussion about race. I don't think that cuts it. I think the country, as the president said, is going to have to decide it really wants to address this. This is, you know, 50 years of riots in America, often for the same causes, of the same triggers. And I think there's going to have to be a real mobilization. And I hate to use this cliche, but it's going to take a leader. Imagine, for instance, if one Republican candidate, well, we have 15 to 20 Republican candidates, imagine if one of them, doesn't even matter which one, really decided in a real way to talk to black America, not make a cameo appearance at Howard University or turn up at one convention of the NAACP or whatever, really rolled up his or her sleeves and made some kind of interesting leadership statement about digging into this. But it's not even on the radar screen of one of our two major political parties.
Let me go back to what's been happening here in Washington. The president had this rather unusual summit with Arab leaders, and of all things, he invites 6 countries. These are all allies of the United States, and only 2 of them, David, chose to send their top guys. King Salman of Saudi Arabia sent his number 2 and number 3, and that was pretty much the rule. What do you make of that?
Well, I think that there's no other way to look at the Saudi refusal to send King Salman after they had said that he would be coming as dissing the president. I think presidents don't make that ask without the expectation that they'll say yes. I'm told by people who attended the meetings at Camp David that they were very positive, that getting these people together, the group that came are all pretty much of the same age. They spoke informally. Sheikhs and emirs raised their hands and interrupted. And one person in the White House said to me, you know, one thing we've learned is we should have done this a long time ago. That these allies are important to us, that they've been anxious about American leadership. They needed to sit down with the president and hear the president explain what he's doing. So I think that's one takeaway. They're going to do this meeting again. Hopefully King Salman, if he's well and his health is an issue, will be at the next one. But no question the Saudis gave a kind of qualified negative message in not sending him.
I think you make a very interesting point. I mean, it's like when the president asks somebody if he wants to serve in his cabinet. They always find out beforehand. If the president calls and asks you, what will you say? And you give people a chance. In this case, they asked the king to come and he didn't show up. It's pretty hard to, get past that.
It's not something that makes the White House look impressive as an organization at the moment. It looks a little bit personal towards the president and towards U.S. policy. I think just as interesting the past few weeks as this meeting has been the trade authority drama in which the president and the left of his party have been having some tensions, and there are plenty of Republicans who will support him, maybe enough, maybe not enough. It's been interesting to see the president be cuffed about and rebuffed publicly by some people he used to be able to rely on to obey at least politesse.
And push back.
And push back.
Which he did.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank all 3 of you for being with us this morning. There's been a lot of news this week, and it was good to kick it around with all of you. We'll be back in 1 minute.